As we move into the post-apostolic period, what we begin to see is especially this separation between church and the world in greater relief. A lot of what we see in the New Testament is Christians talking to other Christians. Right? Paul writing to Christians, even the gospel writers are writing to Christians. And so while we see some persecution taking place in Acts, a lot of the focus in Paul's letters is on trying to tell Christians how to, how to live and respond to persecution. But when we get into the history of the post-apostolic period, we have a variety of other sources that give us some insight into a greater insight into how the world, particularly the Gentile Roman Empire, is looking upon this new development. In the first century, it appears to be the case that the Roman Empire and Roman officials looked at Christianity as it was developing as another type of Judaism. Now, Judaism had some special protections and some special provisions under Roman law. What that meant was things like, well, they didn't have to worship the gods. The temple was protected. They could charge taxes that would go to the upkeep of the temple. So a variety of things. They were exempt from the kind of pluralistic, secretistic approach to the Roman Empire where you can hold on to your gods as long as you accept all these other gods. But that wasn't enforced with Jews. Jews being very monotheistic, that caused several rebellions, and so eventually Rome gave them some concessions, and so Jews were, a licensed religion that was allowed to just worship its own God and didn't have to, recognize the gods of the empire. Well, as Christianity is developing, a lot of Roman officials look at it as, well, it's just another type of Judaism, and so there isn't a great concern about it. By the end of the first, by the end of the first century and into the second century, however, Christianity is beginning to change. Most of the people that are joining Christianity in that later period, due to the work of Paul and others, are Gentiles. And so it's becoming less of a Jewish religious group and more of a Gentile religious group. So Jews are becoming more hostile, not all Jews, some Jews are becoming more hostile, especially leadership, towards Christians, and a lot of the makeup of the Christian church is changing as well. And so for the Roman Empire, both officially and kind of on the ground, this is looking like a different type of group that isn't Judaism. And so there are some concerns about what this group is and what the relationship between what the relationship it should have with the state. Ultimately, in the post-apostolic period, you see a lot, like if you would look at the historical evidence of the time, you would see a lot of suspicion from Rome and Romans. They aren't sure what this group is, and what they begin to know about Christianity, they are concerned about. And there are a variety of rumors that fly around about Christians. Now, there aren't too many pagan sources from the time that have survived. So most of what we have related to this are Christians trying to respond to some of these things that they're accused of. And briefly, excuse me, there are a couple of things that Romans, Gentiles, pagans, are concerned about when it comes to Christians. They refer to them as atheists. They practice incest and cannibalism we touched on the cannibalism a little bit in another video. The Christians aren't intellectuals. This was especially important for the elite philosophers. Christians come from the lower classes. They're not good citizens, all these kind of things. Now, where do some of these ideas come from? Well, the idea that Christians were atheists seems odd to us because of the importance that Christianity, or that God plays in Christianity. But what the Roman Empire meant, what people in the Roman Empire meant when they called them atheists, was the idea that Christians didn't believe in the Roman gods. And so these were people that were atheists. And, that's a great concern for many Romans because of the importance of the gods to the health and stability of the Roman Empire, right? That if more and more people turn away from the gods, then the gods are not, they're going to withdraw their favor from Rome, and Rome is going to crumble. So, yes, Christians believe in that God, but they are actually atheists. They don't believe in the gods. Now, we talked about cannibalism as being a misunderstanding of what was taking place in the Lord's Supper. The idea of incest, of course, is related to the fact that even husbands and wives are considered to be brothers and sisters in Christ. And so here is this brother and this sister who are married to each other, so Christians practice incest. There are the non-intellectuals from the lower classes. Those, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. The fact that they were not, or the accusation that they were not good citizens, had to do with they weren't going to participate in certain civic ceremonies for the good of the Roman Empire, right? So you wouldn't, as a Christian in the 2nd century, 3rd century, excuse me, you weren't going to worship the gods, you weren't going to worship the emperor as God, you weren't going to participate in a variety of ceremonies that would involve some sort of sacrifice to the gods, right? And so all of these things were considered to be civic responsibilities for the good of the city, for the good of the state, for the good of the empire. So Christians, right, are not participating in this. And so you have from the outside, this is the outside looking in as to how they're viewing Christianity. Christians, on the other hand, looking out, are developing some clearer theologies about relationships to society. Excuse me. And this shows up in a couple of ways, in a couple of phrases. One way that a lot of the Christians that we know of from the time period talked about this is talked about the two ways. Now, what did they mean? Well, coming from Matthew chapter 7 and Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, right, there's the way that leads to life and there is the way that leads to death. Right? So there are two ways in life that can be followed. The way of living, right, Christianity, or, the way of death, the broad way that leads to destruction. Christians also thought of themselves, talked about themselves as a third race. Another way to try and talk about their distinction from the rest of the world. So you have Jews, you have Gentiles, and then you have Christians. Or you have Greeks, you have barbarians, the way the Greeks thought of the world, and then you have Christians. So a lot of ways Christians are thinking themselves is this distinct group that is separate from the world. And so, this is kind of a mainstream type of approach in Christianity. But you also have other types of approaches to Christianity. Some people were very radically opposed to being involved in society, right? So they kind of take this the separation to an extreme of saying we have to completely break ourselves off from the rest of the pagan world. And that includes, not just the civic ceremonies, not just the other expressions of pagan idolatrous living. It includes not reading philosophy, a lot of the heresies of Gnosticism, particularly for a lot of 2nd and 3rd century Christians. Well, that came from people reading Greek philosophy. So you got to stay away from that. You got to stay away from a lot of the entertainment, which makes sense because a lot of the entertainment started off with sacrifices either to the emperor or to the gods. Other Christians, however, wanted to try and find a way in which they could take the good in pagan culture and use it. So trying to find ways where philosophy and Christian theology overlapped. Right? So here's this teaching we have, and the philosophers were saying the same thing. Right? So Plato or Aristotle or whoever, we're saying the same thing that those people did. So instead of abandoning philosophy, they're trying to use it for a way to talk to pagans, and try to find concepts in pagan philosophy that they can use to try and express Christian truths. Now, of course, the problem becomes if you go too far in either of these directions. Radical opposition, if you completely separate yourself from the world, how do you reach out and share the message? Right? We're supposed to be in the world and not of the world. We're supposed to be making disciples. We're supposed to be baptizing them, teaching them everything that Jesus commanded. Right? We're supposed to go into all the world and preach the gospel. So you can't completely separate yourself off from the world as some people wanted to do. But on the other hand, you can accommodate yourself so much that in your attempt to try and express Christian truths according to philosophy or the ethics of the time, you water down or you misrepresent or you misinterpret what the true teaching of Christianity is. So there's certainly some dangers in either approach, but at its foundation is this concern that there has to be a difference between the church and society. There is something distinct about this. As one expression of this attempt to try and lay out who Christians were in response to some of these things was a group that later becomes known as the apologists. These were the people who responded to the challenges that Christians were facing from pagan culture. These are people with names like Justin, Athenagoras, Tertullian. All of these were individuals who wrote apologies to try and defend Christianity. Now, apology in this sense does not mean saying something like, well, I'm sorry that I'm a Christian. Apology here comes from a Greek word that means defense. So the apologists were defending Christianity. And in their defense, there were a couple of things that they pointed to. First, against the argument that Christians were atheists, many of them would often say, well, if we are atheists, then your beloved philosophers were atheists as well, since many of them did not believe in the Greek and Roman gods either. Right? And whether that's the Stoics, whether that's Plato, a lot of those philosophers rejected the notion of the Greek gods at the time. So you love the philosophers. If you think we're atheists, they're atheists as well. Right? And so that connection with philosophy, which would have been useful for some people, but not useful for others. To the various claims about the immorality of Christians, the apologists said, well, look at our lives. Right? You claim that we practice incest, you can't claim that we practice cannibalism, there are all sorts of other things that they accuse Christians of morally. Look at our lives, look at the kind of people we are. And that should be clear enough to demonstrate that we are not an immoral people. I mean, certainly some of the challenges, like they're not intellectuals, they come from the lower classes, that in some ways was true of good sizable portions of Christianity, in the sense that some of them were not classically trained or educated. You know, it's not that Christianity was totally from the poor classes, but there were quite a few Christians in this time period that came from lower classes. Often that meant slaves, of course, but a lot of the elites also had problems because of the number of women and children that were a part of Christianity as well, and kind of reflecting the prejudices of the time against women and children. But in a sense, of course, that's who the message was for, was the people that were rejected by society. You know, so that isn't really an emphasis of saying, no, we're actually intellectuals. I mean, you know, certainly some people tried to emphasize the intellectual component of Christianity, but there isn't this concerted effort to say, we'll get rid of all the women and children and only focus on men, right? You know, there doesn't seem to be that kind of concern. So that argument is just kind of ignored. To the argument that Christians weren't good citizens, again, the apologists appealed to the lives that they lived. While they did not participate in certain civic ceremonies, the emphasis was, we are not subversive to the government, we're not trying to start a revolution, we are not spies, we're not an advanced force to try and overturn the Roman Empire. We pay our taxes, we pray for the emperor, even though we don't worship him, right? We're not sacrificing to him, we still pray for him, we're not trying to overthrow him. And so the emphasis becomes, you know, this defense of Christianity based on, you know, refuting these arguments that outsiders had.